Daniel González, Intento 2. Today we are going to talk about Nigeria, the conflict between Muslims and Christians. So in a general overview, Nigeria in the past, since 1914, was divided between two Nigerias. The southern Nigeria, that was a colony and a protectorate, and northern Nigeria, that was just a protectorate under the rule of the emir in a Muslim traditional system. Today, Nigeria is home to more than 200 million people. It is the number 136 out of 184 in the Global Corruption Perception Index as of 2016. And in the same year, Nigeria was the third country in the Global Terror Index. So the problem with Nigeria is that it is a very big country, and since it is so big, we can say that there is one country, but there are many realities. For example, if we divided the country among their major ethnic groups, we would see that there are many different ethnic groups, but the majority of the country are the Hausa Fulani in the north that make up almost 1/3 of the whole population, the Yoruba in the southwest that make the 20%, and the Igbo in the southeast that make the 18%. Among the others, they make the rest of the percentage. In the same way, the north, that was previously during the colonization, the northern Nigeria protectorate, is now a series of 12 states that currently have Sharia law, since Muslim people or population is predominant in this part. The southern part does not have any Sharia law. In the same way, we can see that the northern states are poorer and have less vaccinations than the southern states. This part that we will see later is one of the richest, or rather the richest part of Nigeria, since it concentrates most of the oil producing area. And since it is so rich, it creates many problems. For example, here was the Biafra Republic that tried to gain independence in the Biafran War. And here too is the uh, Niger Delta, that is another zone that is highly contested and fought over. All right, so in Nigeria, historically, it hasn't been the most peaceful country, especially since its independence in 1960 and the decolonization process that lasted 3 years. Nigeria has had 6 coups d'etat in just 50 years. In the same time, it had 2 presidential assassinations, one civil war. Now, here are all the dates, but what we are going to focus today is in the current conflict, or rather conflicts. All right, so the motivations. There are many motivations for the current conflicts. We can see that there is the ethnical factor that places the Igbo versus the Hausa Fulani versus the Yoruba versus the other ethnicities. But also we have the economical factors that place the North against the South, the environmental factors, when we can see that a part of the population that is organized in the Niger Delta militants fight the oil companies and the state. We have religious factors that are Muslims versus Christians, but even more than Muslims versus Christians as a broad category, we can see that is Boko Haram versus the moderate Muslims versus the Christians. And finally, political. Boko Haram is not only a religious group, it's also a political one. So in its beginnings, it considered itself as the fighters for freedom in the state, since the political sphere is very contested. As well, we can see that there are many cases of the state fighting the opposition, be it Boko Haram, the Niger Delta militants, or simply protesters. All right, so we're going to start with the Christians. The Christians make between the 47 and 49% of the total population. That equals around 80 million. And from these 80 millions, we have that Protestants make up around 74%, Catholics make the 25%, and other denominations, including the small Orthodox Nigerian church, make around 1%. This is very important because the expansion of Protestant evangelical churches, especially in the belt of the country, uh, became targets for both unrest and for further attacks against both Christians and Muslims. Muslims, in the other hand, they make around 51 to 53% of the population. That equals 90 million. And mostly they are Sunni, being the 94%. Shia, they are a small minority that has increased in the recent years. Sufi, less than 1 million or 1%. And Ahmadiyya make around 3% of the country. All right, so Boko Haram is the terrorist group that was founded in 2002 by a man called Mohammed Ali. He started an ehira, a religious travel to find peace. Among his travels, he decided to found a community that dedicated itself to have a Sharia law, but also that had the spirit of the Muslim rule. He was killed in 2003, and in this year, his successor was Mohammed Yusuf. He decided to make a bigger commune, but he also started to make forced conversions and assassinations. Uh, People say that he was a highly skilled speaker, and as well he was very charismatic. In 2009, Mohammed Yusuf started having clashes with security forces, and this led to the bombardment of the commune, but also to his execution and the persecution of many of the members of Boko Haram. Boko Haram started disseminating to the near countries to hide, and in 2010 and 2011, they became radicalized, even starting to have suicide attacks and aligning themselves with groups like Al Qaeda. His most famous, or rather infamous, act was the kidnapping of 275 girls in 2014. Of these 275 girls, 51 escaped in the 6 months following their kidnapping, and 100 were later returned as a gesture of goodwill from Boko Haram to achieve a small deal with the government. All right, so the attacks that have been perpetrated both by Boko Haram as well as the state against fighters or civilians has resulted in near 32,000 deaths since 2011. And as we can see here, they are still going on. They had their highest points in 2014 and 15 with these two high peaks, and they started to go low, and they are starting to resurface again. The attacks of Boko Haram are not reduced on Christians, and since most of the population in the zones that Boko Haram attacks are Muslims, and they are Muslims that are embracing, as the group says, Western ideology as democracy or politics in general. They have to be punished since they are heretics. So in the first years of the conflict, from 2011 to 2014, we can see that most of the attacks were against churches, with mosques being a small percentage. In 2015, after the triumph of a new president that was elected by the votes of the Muslim majority in the north, Boko Haram started doing more attacks against mosques. And as I was mentioning before, most of the attacks are in this part. This is the zone where Boko Haram was born and where they still have their base of operations. Between 2011 and 2014, they tried to claim this zone as part of an Islamic state, but they were quickly pushed back by the government forces. Even though the government has had some major advances in fighting Boko Haram, they haven't been able to destroy them. And as we can see here, most of the middle part that is populated by both Christians and Muslims does have some well, attacks, and they are fairly deadly, but most of the casualties and the attacks are in the zones that are controlled by the terrorist group, including 304 attacks in the state of Borno. Boko Haram in 2015 pledged allegiance to the ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria and the Levant, and they renamed themselves to the Islamic State's West African Province or the Islamic State of West Africa. But in 2016, there was a schism between the groups, and one part of the group reverted to being Boko Haram, as we know it today, and the other part became the Islamic State of West Africa. After the election of President Buhari, as I was mentioning before, both Boko Haram and the Islamic State of West Africa started increasing their violence against Muslim population in the north and the middle. But even though the attacks on Christians by Boko Haram has descended, this hasn't been the case for everything, since there is also the ethnic conflict where Fulani herdsmen have been attacking both Igbo and other minority populations in the south that are mainly Christians. We can say that there is a mainly religious objective in all the attacks, since both religious and ethnic and economic um, and other principles overlap, and so we have these kind of attacks. In February 2018, 101 people were kidnapped from a school. To this day, they haven't been all rescued. The group, the Fulani herdsmen that captured them or kidnapped them, released some to avoid being executed by the security forces, but many others remain missing. In 2019, when some Catholics were having a funeral in a church, some gunmen came in and killed 17 people and 2 priests, as well as burning 50 houses. This was condemned by both the Catholics, the bishops, and the Protestant population. In February and March of 2019, there were many attacks to villages, both by Fulani herdsmen and by Boko Haram, resulting in the death of more than 300 people, with the village almost completely destroyed. Plus, there was an unknown number of maimed or raped victims that couldn't be found. The exact numbers of all terrorist attacks in Nigeria are difficult to be known, since the government has uh, well, doesn't have the capacity to investigate all the crimes. The effects of these kinds of attacks have resulted in the death of between 32,000 and 39,000 people, but most of the death are people or members of Boko Haram that die in clashes with state actors, other security forces, including a small task force that was deployed in 2016 by the United States to protect the oil companies. But the second biggest casualties are still being civilians that make up almost half of the casualties. Along with those people that were killed, we have that there are 2.5 million displaced people with 244,000 refugees that are outside of Nigeria. Another important group that is still fighting in Nigeria is the Niger Delta militants. This is not one group, there are many movements that have many objectives. For example, the MENT, the Movement for Emancipation of the Niger Delta, has as his objective to achieve social justice and to do economical attacks against both the government and multinational companies, since more than half of the population of the Niger Delta live in poverty. And the other important group of the region is the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni people, the MOSOP, that they have social, economical, and environmental objectives, including the protesting against the environmental degradation that in 1994 sparked riots that ended with 4 officers killed, and this led to the execution of both Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 members of his group. In 1998, the Mossad started doing terrorist attacks like the destruction of oil pipes and the kidnapping of oil workers. The future of the conflict, well, the conflict first has to go through a serious campaign of inter-religious dialogue, but not limited to inter-religious, but intra-religious dialogue. So all factions between the Muslims can dialogue and start taking a stronger position to condemn both the radicalization but also the persecution. And the same among the Christians, they have to join themselves to make a stronger position claiming for peace and avoiding sparking new riots or new protests against the Muslim minorities in the south or the Christian minorities in the north. There also has to be a campaign of education. Most of the northern part of the country has very low levels of alphabetization, and also there is this stigma of Western education. This was supported and is promoted by the traditional Muslim view, or rather the Boko Haram view, that believes that Western education is a threat to Islam, so it has to be deterred. And since many of the elites of the North do not have their children in Nigerian schools, rather they send them to Western schools, they were targeted too by the Boko Haram. There has to be an anti-corruption campaign. Since 2016, the president has claimed that there have been malversation of more than $150 million, but there is no accountability. In the same space of accountability, there has to be accountability for military personnel that are fighting Boko Haram, since as a National Geographic reporter um, says it, he went in Nigeria to find those who are fighting Boko Haram, and the population told him that the day before, the soldiers had massacred the whole village under the pretense that they were hiding Boko Haram soldiers or combatants. So there are many violations of human rights, and even though the fight of Boko Haram has to take a primordial place, so does the respect for the civilian lives. And finally, there has to be an attention for the social demands, since many of the riots that are suppressed or persecuted by the government have to do with the rates of poverty, of infant death, and many other problems that are throughout the whole country. Finally, in the words of Ken Saro-Wiwa, to live in Nigeria is to die many times. Thank you very much. Here are my references.